very much for that wonderful introduction. So today we're going to talk a little bit, somewhat in follow-up to last week's talk, because I feel like there's some confusion as to what the term plant-based means. And it is not this group, and it is not any one individual in this group. It is the whole world is confused as to what this terminology means. Sheila, you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering while you were talking if you can also expound on low fat. What does that really mean? The speakers last week said, the diet, but it has to be low fat, but nobody really tells you what that is. And even
Good
if you're doing
question.
avocado and they say, oh, well, that's really fat. So how many grams of fat per day are you really talking about? Even if, the good oils are fat, so could you expound on that while you speak?
Yeah, so that's also a great question, and I would tell you that there's a lot of debate about that too. So there's another one that people don't really agree on, and each person typically makes their own definition of what low fat means.
If you're
Um,
if you're trying to lose weight, what does it mean?
I wouldn't necessarily recommend a low fat diet for trying to lose weight.
Oh, really?
That's a very 1990s approach to diet. I think we've really tried to move. Well, there is definitely some camps that are still very macronutrient focused, really carbs, protein, fat. I think we've tried to move beyond that because we really found that it's not necessarily the macronutrients that determine whether you gain or lose weight. It's really, well, for one, it's the number of calories, but for two, it's the number of things that are satiating and keep you full, and whole foods tend to do that. And many of those whole foods tend to be plants. So that hence why we see things like plant-based diet, low-fat diet going together is they're trying to put those two things together, but I wouldn't necessarily even think about it that way. So now you can see why there's confusion in nutrition is we have people kind of putting their own stake in the ground or using things that are convenient. The term plant-based originally meant, I'm going to share my screen and share a graphic, which I think will help you understand what this actually means. Why can't I see it? Okay, there you go. Originally, plant-based meant that you either a vegetarian, so there's two different kinds of vegetarian, lacto-ova, so that includes dairy and eggs, or a traditional vegetarian, which doesn't have any of those either. And then you've got a pescatarian, which is a vegetarian that also has seafood. And you've got vegan, which has no animal foods at all. And then the more recent terminology, which I actually really love, is a flexitarian. So someone who occasionally has eggs, dairy, or meat. They don't exclude them, but they also don't really eat them on a regular basis. So all of those are plant-based. And actually, we could even move beyond that and say the traditional definition is any diet that is based on plants is plant-based. And when something is based on it, it means the majority of it consists of plants. So it doesn't mean that you don't ever eat any animal foods, but it means that the majority of your diet is coming from plant foods. So that is what plant-based is supposed to mean. Now, the reason you hear it used in other ways is because, well, really two main different things. When we're in the grocery store and we see a label that says plant-based, that's because when you think of the opposite would mean something that is animal-based. It comes from an animal. And that's a really convenient label to put in a grocery, but it's not the same meaning as a plant-based diet. If an item is plant-based in the grocery store, they are trying to tell you that it doesn't contain any animal components, but that's also not really correct. What they should be using is the term vegan or vegetarian, but for marketing reasons, they think that plant-based sounds better. The other reason really is marketing and just ease of use of the terminology. So saying plant-based instead of saying vegan or vegetarian is a much easier thing to say. So it's happened that people just started using the term plant-based more commonly to mean things that are plant-based, but that are excluding things that aren't. Right. So if you said something was plant-based and you meant vegan and vegetarian, then you're now excluding a lot of the other people on this group, but those are plant-based diets. They really truly are plant-based diets. And then other diets that fall outside of this, like say Mediterranean, are really usually plant-based diets as well, because the vast majority of the diet comes from plants. So that's really what it should be defined by. It does not always. And I think you're going to hear a lot of that out there, people misusing that terminology. And because of that, we've actually started to use other terminology, which is going to make it even more complicated. So people who want to make sure that when they say plant-based, you don't think vegan or vegetarian only, well, if they use things like plant forward, plant centric, plant centered, high plant diets, those are terminology you will hear for people who are really trying to make sure that they're using the term plant-based, but they're not excluding people who sometimes get excluded from that term. So I'm going to pause there to see if there are any questions related to that, because that could be a little bit confusing.
You can unmute yourself or type your question in the chat window.
So Leigh, if I were to just kind of reframe on that, it would say that it's really about the, like, literally what's on your one's plate or what's on one's fridge or what's like, and if the majority of it is green or is what we consider a plant that comes from the ground, a vegetable, a fruit, a legume,
Nuts,
that would be plant-based.
berries,
it's about that percentage as opposed to plant-based, as opposed to anything else, as opposed to being exclusively something or trying to be something it's not.
Yes, exactly. And I really love that dichotomy there. It's not about being exclusive, it's about being based on something. Like if you live in the DC area, you are based in DC. That doesn't mean you never leave DC, but it means the vast majority of the time you are in DC.
Okay, another thing about the plant-based, you're talking about real, and I'm just trying to be more specific with the definition. You're not talking about French fries and stuff like that, you know, because that is a potato and blah, 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 blah. So people are getting this thing kind of confused with as long as it's a plant, but I'm not sure if they know what a plant is. and also percentage wise, when you say plant-based, you're talking about, like, I think I can understand it better. 90% or 95% of my plate is a green leafy or something like the previous person interjected, something out of the ground or something. Because these different categories you said, like vegetarian, flexitarian, all of that, that still kind of leaves way to me French fries and things like that aren't specifically the healthy thing that you're talking about. Is that correct?
Yes. So what I'm hearing is two different points there. So one, percentages can be really helpful. So I think that's a great question. By definition, plant-based means 51% or more of your diet comes from plants. So that's pretty loosey-goosey, right? And all the more reason that I think using the terminology plant-based to mean vegan or vegetarian is inaccurate, because you could still eat meat. If you only eat meat once a week, then you're plant-based, right? Or even if you eat meat, you know, a couple of times a week, or if you eat seafood and you have other dairy and eggs and all this, as long as you're not having large amounts of them, you're still plant-based. The other terminology that we typically associate with this is what I like to call Junkitarian. So someone who eats junk. And unfortunately, a lot of people who have gone plant-based or even vegan end up becoming Junkitarians, because what they do is they're trying to replace those foods with some sort of processed, formulated version of that food. So instead of giving up chicken nuggets, they buy these weird amalgamated processed version of a chicken nugget that's made of something that is not chicken. So that is very common, unfortunately, when people, at least when they first start doing it, they don't understand how to have a healthy dietary pattern in that way. The other thing is plant-based absolutely does mean any kind of plant. That means French fries, yada, yada, yada. That's why when we talk about a plant-based diet, we usually talk about a whole foods plant-based diet. You put them together because it's really important to understand that the majority of the diet needs to be both based in plants and based in plants that are in their most natural form possible. Not that you can't have French fries. I love French fries. Nothing wrong with that, but that shouldn't be like 70% of your diet, right? That should be maybe 1% of your diet. And then you can have all the other foods are mostly, you know, broccoli or squash or things that you can get from the grocery store. You cut up, you quickly saute or something, and you eat it in its minimally processed form. And I think that's an extremely important point. And part of the problem that I have with people just saying they're going plant-based is because it leaves out all those other things, which frankly are really the most important part of the diet, right? Like you need to eat a high quality diet first and foremost. Then what exactly it consists of, we can figure out. But figuring out that it's based on whole foods, minimally processed foods is the number one thing when we're talking about diet. And it's why part of the reason we've gotten away from things like low fat, because most of the low fat foods that people switched to were terrible for you because they were incredibly highly processed. They had a lot of added sugar and salt. So low fat was a completely meaningless term because it basically meant processed crap. And that's not what we want you to eat. But I do have some tips on how to do a healthy plant-based diet. Here's 8 tips, and this is from Harvard. So you all know the Harvard Nutrition Source because I talk about it all the time. And we have a link to this article too for you to follow up on. First tip, this is like would be my number 1 tip too. Eat lots of vegetables. Easy tip. Fill half your plate with vegetables at lunch and dinner. Make sure you include plenty of colors, choosing your vegetables. So use your eyes to say, okay, did I get all of the different colors I can get today, right? Did I get orange, red, green, blue? And I don't know if you turned into our webinar this week on autoimmunity, a gut-based approach, but we spent a lot of time talking about that. So we have the recording, and I'm sure Janet will include that when she sends that out. So lots of different vegetables, lots of different colors. And of course, you can also add them as snacks. I think sometimes people get very stuck in what their snacks are, and we need to think a little outside the box. So some hummus, salsa, guacamole with fresh vegetables would be awesome. Or, you know, you've got fruit and nuts. There's lots of different things you can do to get more plants in your diet in a healthy way. Second tip, and this would also be my second tip, I'm so in line with what they're saying on this, change the way you think about meat. So historically in America, when we sat down for dinner, there were 3 things on the plate, right? You've got your protein, your vegetable, and your starch. And that's what the plate looked like. And it was about a third, a third, a third. But if we think of meat in smaller amounts at each time that we eat it, that is a much healthier way of eating it. In fact, in many cultures, due in part to scarcity, due in part to poverty, but it ends up being relatively healthy. Meat is eaten in small amounts. It's eaten all the time, but in small amounts. And so thinking of it maybe as a garnish or a way to add flavor to a dish instead of the centerpiece of what you eat is a healthier way to eat. And that is very much plant-based because you're still most of your food is going to be plants. By far, like 90% of your meal will probably be plants if you're using meat as a garnish, but it's there to provide that little bit of added nutrition and added flavor, and you can still enjoy it and maybe don't feel like you're sacrificing anything or missing out on that. Number 3, and this is going right to your question, Sheila, good fats. Choose good fats. So rather than worrying about the amount of fat in your diet, if you do number 1 and you do number 2, that will all work itself out. Just making sure the fats that you do have are healthy. Number 1 being olive oil. First and foremost, olive oil is a healthy fat. Of course, olives themselves, nuts, nut butters, seeds, and avocados. That's where the majority of your fat should come from. Not that you can't have other types of fats, right? That we don't say, oh, you can never have butter. It just the majority of your fat should come from those healthier sources. And a small amount of your fat could come from things like, say, butter. 4th tip, cook a vegetarian meal at least 1 night a week. So this is a great way to decrease your meat intake in general. Also, I find it's a great way to introduce new recipes, find something fun and interesting because the vegetarian recipes tend to be maybe a little more creative. And sometimes because they feel like they have to be because people don't think vegetarian food is delicious, but that's absolutely not true. Vegetarian dishes is very delicious. Just requires maybe a little bit of planning to make sure you have the right spices and herbs on hand. But some of them can even be based on pantry meals. They don't necessarily have to be super plan aheads. And that was really the idea behind Meatless Monday, which was founded by Johns Hopkins, which is my alma mater. So I'm obviously supportive of that one. Tip number 5 of 8, include whole grains at breakfast. So oatmeal is a classic breakfast food, and there's a reason for that. In the morning, our body has been fasting, and when we are fasting, we need to have carbohydrates, and it gives us that energy, but it most importantly gives us long-lasting energy, and that's because it's a whole grain. So the difference between having oatmeal and a piece of white toast or a pastry, or God forbid, a Pop-Tart, are absolutely huge, despite the fact that there are carbohydrates. So if we were just thinking about macronutrients, they would all get lumped together, but they're not the same at all when we think about whole foods or whole food plant-based diet. The oatmeal is very different. And ideally, you want to get the least processed oatmeal you can. So an old-fashioned rolled oat, or a steel cut oat, as opposed to the instant oats. The other thing about that is there's this concept called chrononutrition. So chrono meaning time, nutrition. And it's about the fact that our bodies become more insulin resistant throughout the day. Now, what is insulin resistance? Basically, it's like diabetes. So it's almost like throughout the day, we start out not being diabetic and we become more diabetic. So when you get your carbohydrates, you want to have them in the morning when you're able to digest them the best way. And so starting the day off with something like oatmeal or quinoa or buckwheat or barley, or some nuts and fresh fruit could all set you up for that success with that long-term energy that you're looking for throughout the day. Tip 6 is go for greens. So I think this is something people seem to get now. Leafy greens, kales, collards, Swiss chard, spinach are a really healthy way to add nutrition to your diet, and also really easy to prepare and very inexpensive. So whatever you're cooking, even if you just like add some greens to it, now you've really increased the nutritional value of that meal and made it more plant-based. Another thing is plant-based doesn't have to be absolute. It's not necessarily a yes or no. It can be a spectrum. So maybe one day you're very plant-based and the next day you're less plant-based, but you're trying to balance that out and move yourself more plant-based. I think that's another really great way to think about it, as opposed to it being black and white. Tip 7, build a meal around a salad. This is what my husband and I do every day for lunch. One, they're simple, and two, you can switch them up really easily. So you have all the base, leafy greens, romaine, spinach, whatever that is. And then what you put on top, you can change that out. You could have beans, peas, tofu. If you wanted to add some fish or some, canned seafood, that would be a great addition. But what you do every day, you can switch that out and it becomes a little less boring. And also it's quite an affordable option for lunch. And by definition, because you're going to have a big bowl full of vegetables, it's going to be plant-based, even if you're adding in some meat to that. And hopefully you're thinking about the meat there as a garnish. All right, the 8th and final tip is eat fruit for dessert. I love fruit, especially when it's in season. I can't think of anything more perfect really than having a fresh in-season peach after a meal. This is an easy one for me, but I know some people really didn't grow up that way. And so it does take a different bit of a mind change. And maybe you have to do something to the fruit to get people to feel like it's more of a dessert. So with the peach, you can grill it quickly and then have a little bit of balsamic vinegar over it. And it's really delicious. And now it feels more like a dish. So it's a bit of a mindset change, but also really giving you that bit of sweetness, which we all want in our life, but in a whole food way, right? So fruit is a whole food as opposed to, I don't know, pie or cake or some sort of baked good that you would have maybe otherwise for dessert. And you're limiting your processing by having that fruit for dessert. Also, the sugar in fruit, I don't really worry too much about because you're getting it as a whole food. You're getting it with fiber, all of these things. And people sometimes get really crazy about sugar. Sugar is not great for us. But if you're getting it in a whole food form, you typically don't eat that much, particularly if you're having, a nice meal that is plant-based beforehand, and then you're having some fruit. You're not going to eat a whole, obscene amount of peaches that are going to give you a large amount of sugar, whereas it's very easy to eat even a portion size of a traditional dessert and get too much sugar. So those are my tips, and I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now so you can all see my screen. How do where did my... There we go. All right. Well, I see we've got messages in the chat. Let me take a look.
I was just copying and pasting what you were sharing from the link, Leigh, as you were talking.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
What can I say, Leigh? One of the things that you've actually said at one of these events, one of our mindfulness experiences, I'll turn my video on in a second, that I've taken with me actually, since you said it maybe a year ago, who knows the time, what's time, is that having frozen fruit on hand and frozen vegetables is really good because, and it's not not just because it's not canned, but even better, it was because it's usually picked and then frozen when it's at its best. So like now is not a good time to get a juicy peach.
Right.
But I have a bunch of frozen mixed peach, mango smoothie kind of mixes in my freezer, and I could easily heat those up, defrost them, and have a peach for dinner tonight. So you saying that frozen fruits and vegetables were a good choice has stuck with me.
Awesome. I'm super glad to hear that. And I think that's an excellent example because you're right. Peaches, part of the reason they immediately think of seasonality is because that's when they're good. If you buy a peach out of season, it's just disappointing, right? Womp womp. But the frozen peach is still going to have that amazing flavor. The texture is going to be a little different, but almost kind of lends itself to desserts just as well because it's, now it's almost more like a pudding. You've got a soft spoonful of frozen peaches, or maybe you throw a little bit of nuts or some granola on it to give it some crunch. I think that's a great option. Thank you for sharing that. Let's see what we got here. So Luann is asking about vegetarians use Junkitarian items as our meat additive. Still mostly plants in the meal, but a fake meat item as a flavor adding item. Yeah, that is a concern. And it's all about the level of processing. So tofu is a traditional processing method. It's almost more of a fermented product. So that's not really what I'm talking about, but I'm talking about the things that, when you buy kids chicken nuggets, I think we all recognize that is not, it's not really chicken anymore, right? Like it's been processed into some sort of weird shape and it's got a whole bunch of things. The same thing is what happens with a lot of these vegetarian protein alternatives is they took a bunch of ingredients and they mushed them together and they extruded them into some weird shape. And now we call that our meat alternative. So it's definitely a little bit concerning. Now, there are some more modern versions, like say the Impossible or Beyond Burger, which aren't exactly that same thing. And it's not clear if they are of a similar value. In fact, there's been some preliminary research showing that there is some benefit. So if you do nothing but swap a red meat burger, probably, a regular CAFO, low quality red meat burger, right? We're not talking local grass-fed beef. But if you swap that for a Beyond or an Impossible burger, that people did seem to have better labs. So when they went to the doctor, their blood looked better. I don't know what that means long-term. I don't know if that means that maybe they don't feel as full afterwards. It doesn't seem to be that way, but they are definitely created differently than, I don't know, for instance, corn with a Q, which is, extruded wheat protein. So that is about as processed as it gets. But then if we're talking about, a veggie burger that's made with like beans that have been pressed together and it's not totally distorted into some other object, that's also a different item. So it's really about each individual item, whether it's a problem or not. And I think sometimes we can also do a little bit of this for ourselves, right? How do you feel after you eat it? Are you full for 30 minutes and then, in an hour you're hungry again? Then that's probably not a great item for you to be eating. And you want to find something that's a little less processed. Sheila, you have another question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask you about the amount of plants again. I had read a couple of years ago, Terry Walls's book, how she transformed herself through plants, which is a real good examples about how plants can really help. But she was saying you had to have so much of it, like 2 little small salads a day. It's not going to change anything on the cellular level, whatever. Can you speak more about that? I think she was saying like 8 cups.
8 to 10 servings a day is what she said.
So could you talk a little bit about the amount and maybe based on what you're trying to do? Because she was actually trying to heal some things, as opposed to just eating on a regular, so could you talk a little bit about that, the amount?
So yeah, Terry is definitely looking at a different population, right? So she's not just thinking about general healthy eating, she's thinking about healing autoimmunity. So you do have to turn things up a little bit higher. That being said, I don't think an 8 to 10 serving goal of plants per day is unreasonable. It's really, that would be in line with a lot of things that we're, thanks, Janet. That would be in line with a lot of things that we're talking about. But you have to be very intentional about it, and you'd have to probably start having some vegetables at breakfast. So that probably is not going to be the goal for everyone. Really the dietary guidelines for America, God bless them, they have the strive for 5. They only want you to get 5 servings of plants a day. That's not enough. So somewhere between 5 and 10 is probably about where you want to be. And I would say, 7 to 8 is probably a good goal in terms of servings of plants a day. The good thing is you do get to put everything in there. So your nuts, your lentils, your beans, your vegetables, your fruits, all of that goes into that plant group. And when you look at that, then maybe it's a little bit easier to get to those 7 to 8 servings, or if you want to be actually therapeutic, 8 to 10 servings. Great question.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Oh, I got a question about, do I have a favorite cookbook? Ooh, that's a great question. I had a great cookbook back in the day. I'm trying to remember. It was called Almost Meatless. And that, I think, is a great way of thinking about how to do a plant-based diet. You don't even necessarily have to have every meal. Oh, cool beans. That's a good one too. You don't necessarily have to have every meal be meatless. Like, you could have meat at every meal, but just do it in very small amounts. And that's still plant-based. And that's much more realistic, I think, for the average person. Now, maybe breakfast is one that's pretty easy to get meat out of, right? You have your oatmeal and your nuts, that's no big deal. And maybe even lunch, not that hard. But for dinner, especially if you're eating out, some people really want to have meat. And so having it be almost meatless, I think, is a really great way of thinking about it. Linda, you're asking about the serving size. I'm assuming you're asking what is a serving size, and it actually varies for each individual item because it's somewhat based on the size of the item, right? Like when you put broccoli into something, it looks different than when you put spinach in it, but on average, it's about a cup. So when we're talking 7 to 8 servings, we'd be talking 7 to 8 cups, but that's uncooked. So like a cup of broccoli, when you cook it, ends up being like a tablespoon. Or not broccoli, I'm sorry, spinach. I was thinking, but on the other hand, broccoli doesn't really cook down. So there's ways to get more nutrition, and that's actually one that I would say where maybe a salad is not the best approach with spinach, right? So cooking spinach is probably the best way to get more spinach into you. And also you can add other things to it, like garlic, that will add some good flavor that you maybe wouldn't put in your salad, because we also about variety and diversity. So with that, I do want to stop just because I want to make sure we have enough time to go through what Elizabeth has planned for us. It's really wonderful. If you have any questions, I will keep answering them in the chat though.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Leigh. It's always really helpful to hear buzzwords broken down and then also built back up again. And one of the things I'll actually share before we get started with my portion with capital P, if no pun intended, was that my pandemic coping strategy, I got really into cooking, like in a kind of an extreme way, and which is not a bad thing to get into in an extreme way. And I did want to share some of my favorites, if that's okay. So I really loved Good and Cheap. And now this is by Leanne Brown. And one of the things that she emphasizes, and there is some meat in here, is that vegetables are actually less expensive, like per ounce, than meat is. So a lot of her really amazing, delicious recipes are just inherently plant forward based, whatever one wants to, however you want to define it, by being a good meal. And I think for me, a lot of times, like my boyfriend and I will sit down and be like, oh, we were accidental vegetarians today. And it's just because the things that we decided to cook were really good. So on that note, and I also use the New York Times Kitchen app a lot. There we go. But anyway, the next one was Longevity Kitchen. And this is by Rebecca Katz, I believe. And I'll send, of course, links to these. I purchased this at a Food as Medicine workshop conference offered by the Center for Mind Body Medicine. And so that's when I came to really love that book. I shared Cool Beans. This is by the Washington Post food editor, Joe Yonan. And really fabulous. And then also, interestingly, 6 Seasons, A New Way with Vegetables. So this is Joshua McFadden, and it is not exclusive of meat by any stretch, but it does center the vegetable on the plate. And is also a really, I find that one to be a great resource when I get something, I'm like, what do I do with this? Black radishes would be a good example. And the answer is to make a very delicious sauce with them. In any event, those are some of my favorites as someone who got very into cooking during the pandemic and is a self-proclaimed pescatarian for a very long time now. My mother, Kathy, can attest. On that note, of being all together here, it is always a pleasure. So thank you very much to Janet and Leigh for welcoming me back. We're going to be exploring some stretching and self-massage today. So think of what the first part of that I encourage you to do is to check in with your body. And the first muscle we're going to use and stretch today is the one that you have been building over the past 2 years in our weekly gatherings of mindfulness and checking in. So I'm going to have a timer going. If everyone wants to sit comfortably, gather your breath, slow down for a moment. Let's begin with a diaphragmatic breathing mindfulness exercise together. And exhale. Breathe in through your nose. Out through your mouth. Find a cadence that feels helpful, centering for you. And take these couple of moments. This is simply a suggestion to take these couple of moments to scan your body. What's talking to you today? As you inhale, see if you can expand your body in all directions. What would it feel like for your ribs to expand? What would it be like for your neck to extend taller, like a gentle string pulling you straight up? What is it like to let your shoulders drop? Now let your breath return to its regular rhythm, its comfortable way. Think of someone or something who brings joy and love to your life. And open your eyes with a soft gaze. Okay, well, thank you so much for flexing your mindfulness muscle today. That was really just 3.5 minutes. And I'd be curious if anyone is experiencing their body in noticing anything in a different way, or if it's exactly the same or something in between. But as I just said, so I am a licensed massage therapist here in Washington, D.C. And my intention and goal for all of my clients is to be able to stay healthy and well on their own, either between sessions, after session, continuing the work on. So these are not trade secrets. These are things that I encourage you to do at home. One thing that would be helpful, I'm going to show you some of my favorites, but if you also want to just jump in the chat and say if there are specific areas of your body that you find are difficult to address or bother you chronically, I can address those. I show some potential options there. So Sherry, your shoulder, I feel you. So one of the, especially now we're all, many of us have been here for a very long time, even prior to the pandemic. I called it modern life syndrome, where we're very forward and down, whether it's texting, typing, driving, biking, walking the dog. So these forward chest muscles come concave, pulling on the back. So we feel a lot of junk back there, but really a lot of the genesis of the issue can come from having some tight shoulders. So the first thing I want to show you, and I'm actually going to, okay, here we go. So the first thing I want to show you is a chest stretch. So all you need for this is a door frame. So we're going to welcome to my vestibule. And I'm doing this in my house and not in my office, really intentionally, because I want to show you how it is done in our own homes. So the first thing is to find your arm at a 90-degree angle, come flush to the wall. I have my elbow is in line with my shoulder. I'm taking my feet out to 45 degrees and turning my body to meet my feet. Hold and return back. Come out the same way. So you can also continue that work and get more into your bicep just by anchoring yourself on the wall there and coming forward. But to get that shoulder, to get those between the shoulder blade points, you want to have it focused, because the shorter you're creating more focus on this front chest pectoral muscle. We can even do this without the door, simply raising and coming back into some cactus arms. So everyone join me real fast. Just open up your arms straight up and back into some cactus and just hold and feel what it's like to squeeze those shoulder blades together. And I know it's often where it hurts, but just trust me, just squeeze those shoulder blades together. Feel a stretch in the front and release. Okay, I think I got a Nadia, that's good. I think that's what you do, a thumbs up. Okay, so it was good, let's do it again. So we're gonna come up and around and hold and squinch them together and release. So I always recommend doing things several times, especially if they're static stretches, hold and release. Normally, I also recommend perhaps doing a couple jumping jacks before doing any sort of stretching or self-massage. I think of it as if you're working on dry spaghetti versus wet spaghetti, you're going to get that wet spaghetti to move a lot more. So even just some, like, you can't see me doing a little dancing here, but feet out and back, jumping jacks, whatever makes you feel good. Warm your body up first, and you'll have much better results from the massage or the stretching. So on the floor, to get to those shoulders, moving shoulders, great. Get this out of here. Thanks for bearing with me, everybody. So here are some of my favorite tools. I have an orb, and I'm sending Janet the links to send out to everybody exactly what these are. So this is about the same tensegrity as a tennis ball, a little firmer. This is good. I really like this for legs, and I'll show you something for your hamstring in a moment. And the hamstring, very helpful for low back pain. And then this guy is the peanut. If you ask my father, he would call this a torture device, but I call it extremely effective. Yes, so, and thank you, Jennifer. I do see your request about the traps. So first I'm going to show you how to use the tennis ball, really, or any of them. A lot of people and a lot of things on the internet demo them doing up against the wall. I don't get it. I always recommend people do it on the floor. You can find a lot more stability, and you have more control, and you're not fighting gravity. So I have some pillows here. Make yourself comfortable. Okay. So I'm going to place this right underneath my shoulder blade. It's going to feel really nice after that stretch. So here, and I found a spot, and we all kind of know what the spot is, right? I don't know if I necessarily, but if you find something that's a little more tender than the rest, it's a good place to go. Hold it, have a pillow under your head so you can relax naturally and with comfort. And then instead of moving the tennis ball, move your arm or your leg or whatever, wherever you're working. So in this case, I'm going to do big circles with my arm. And this is going to get all of the different directions of that rhomboid and also into my erector spinae, aka the muscles behind the shoulder blade and next to the spine. And I'm going to do that all different motions. I might go across my body, etc. So I know this looks very very basic, and my goal is that it is, and I want to show you that you can achieve like a lot of pain-free at home. Another very popular one for the tennis ball is to go under your glute, under your butt. A lot of that will also often feed into helping low back pain. Some people may be familiar with sciatica, the feeling of nerves going down the back of your leg. So let's find a spot under the glute, and also just feels good for those of us who move, which I hope is everyone. So going under here, I'm going to find that tender spot, roll on it, find it. Oh, there it is. Okay, so now I'm back down. And now I'm rotating my leg. I'm extending, going to the side, and then find another point around and to the side. So I like the tennis ball. I find it to be firm, but not overwhelming. Some people are more of a lacrosse ball. I think this is way too intense for my body. If the tennis ball is too intense for your body, I recommend doing this either on a padded chair or a couch. That will take some of the pressure off of that spot. The orb, this is another gentle way. This is great for your glute as well, the way that I was just demonstrating. I really also like using the orb underneath my hamstring. If you have knee pain, working on your hamstring is going to also help alleviate, especially on the sides of where you're experiencing. So let me grab that chair real fast that I chucked onto my couch. Hold on. Whoops. There we go. Okay, in my chair. Great. So I'm really just taking this, putting it under, there you go, underneath my leg here, and going forward and down. Moving it up. Whoops, just don't fall off your chair. Moving it up closer. So you want to start, a good way to start is by being closer to the knee, not right in the crevice. Don't go into the crevice. You don't block blood flow. So go here. I personally like actually just hanging out on it, letting the muscle kind of melt, if you will. So it can hang out and allow that pressure, that static pressure to build. Then I can go up a little farther, following the muscle, doing extend, extend, and bring it back down, extend, bring it back down. What would it feel like to be closer in to the groin? I don't know, let's find out. Bring it in, coming out. So self-massage, I know that all of these things look, here's my face. All of these things look and sound simple, and I'm really glad they are. I'm really glad that we all have access to the ways to move our body. So if I were to summarize, and I'm going to get to the traps in a second, but to summarize the strategy and the general strategy here is to have a tool, and that tool can be your body weight, but have a tool, place it in a spot that feels tender, that feels like it could use a little love, and then rotate around that spot. And then go next. Like you can go and just go into small inches, place to place, and that will help really address, again, not only the muscle that's yelling at you, talking very loudly, but the structures that are around it. For traps, this is actually one I use. I recommend using. One can actually use their own hand. So the traps, for those who are new to anatomy, are actually a very large back muscle, but the very top of it is this, the sloping of your shoulder. It's the very top of the, what we call the anterior, upper anterior trapezius. So you can see it if I squeeze, if I elevate my shoulder, you can see this triangle pocket here. Using the knuckle of your thumb, go to that across your body while it's stretched. Put the knuckle right in that triangle pocket, squeeze around the edge, and then let the shoulder go and hold. Bring it back up again. Go a little to left, go a little farther out. What does that feel like? Oh, that feels, that's very a lot more intense for me. And release. One more side to this. What happens if you bring your head to the opposite side? The release. I really like, I teach this a lot. The ice cream scoop is what I call it. This is also for continuing to work on that same area. Bring your arm up and around. Scoop your head as the ice cream here. And to the side, a gentle pull. Just allow the weight of your arm, the weight of your hand is doing the work here. And then to intensify this, bring it to the next level, bring your arm out to the side. And here you might feel this in your shoulder. And bring it down. I also do this coming forward. I do this coming to the side. It's often going to the side. I find that feels safer for me if I'm up against a wall. I hope everyone really likes my apartment. So here, I'm coming around the angle and going down. Holding anything for 3 to 4 breaths, if not more. I find that to be very effective. You don't want to rush it. This is your time to explore with your body. So stretching the front to get those as a summary. I want to check the time check here. It's the summary to work some of the upper body things that we talked about today. Opening up the shoulders, doing that big stretch. You could even have, if you're on the floor, you could have something into your spine, or even just putting your arms out to the side. We do this a lot less frequently than I think I know, at least I think I do, which just says do it a lot. Bring it out to the side. Find a tool, find a support. So the tool would, in this case, was the tennis ball. The support was the ground, and the movement was with my arm. So similarly with our glute, we found the support, tool, movement. With our hamstring, we found the support of the chair, wherever it is, the chair, the tool, and our own movement. With the door, there was the support, the tool was my hand, and the movement. So I hope that this was fast and dirty, but I hope that it was a nice guide to self-massage. You very, very low chance that you will hurt yourself, because you will know when it feels like it's too much. So please, I encourage you to explore, see how it feels, support, tool, movement. All right, and